Prisons are often described as places of punishment, but that word barely explains what actually happens inside their walls. Punishment sounds temporary, loud, and obvious. What truly defines modern high-security prisons is something quieter and far more calculated. Design, not just the bars, not just the locked doors, but the way space itself is used to shape human behavior. From the outside, a prison looks like concrete and steel. From the inside, it feels like a system that never stops observing, guiding, and limiting every movement. Every hallway, every corner, every distance between two walls exists for a reason. Nothing is accidental. The size of a cell, the height of a ceiling, the angle of a camera, the direction a door opens. These choices are not architectural preferences. They are tools. In high-security and Supermax prisons, control doesn't rely on constant force. It relies on predictability. When a person knows exactly where they can go, how far they can walk, what they can see, and when they can move, resistance becomes harder. Over time, the environment itself does the work. Guards do not need to shout. The building speaks for them. This documentary explores how prison design quietly shapes the daily reality of incarceration, how architecture becomes authority, and space becomes a form of discipline, not through violence, not through chaos, but through structure. Consider how most people experience space in everyday life. We choose where to sit, where to walk, how long to stay somewhere. We seek windows, open rooms, fresh air, distance, privacy. These choices give us a sense of control over our own bodies and time. In prison, especially at the highest security levels, those choices disappear. Space is no longer something you move through freely. It is something that moves you. Cells are built to restrict more than movement. They restrict perception. Narrow windows limit how much sky can be seen. Solid doors reduce sound and visibility. Lighting is often constant, eliminating natural cues for time. When days begin to feel the same as nights, and weeks blend together, the environment quietly reshapes how time is experienced. Hallways are long and empty by design. They discourage lingering. They prevent conversation. They ensure that movement happens only with permission and purpose. Even recreation areas, when they exist, are often enclosed by high walls that block any view beyond the prison itself. The message is subtle but constant. There is nowhere else to go. Surveillance is another invisible layer of architectural control. Cameras are positioned not just to watch behavior, but to remind people they are always visible. When someone does not know exactly when they're being watched, they assume they're always being watched. Over time, this uncertainty changes behavior. People regulate themselves. This is not accidental. These principles trace back to theories developed centuries ago, ideas that believed order could be maintained not by force, but by structure. Modern prisons refine those theories with technology, psychology, and engineering. The result is an environment where control is embedded into the walls. For incarcerated individuals, this kind of design affects more than daily routines. It affects identity. When a person is reduced to a fixed location, a number, a cell, a schedule, the sense of self begins to narrow. Decisions that once defined individuality are replaced by compliance with space. Stand here. Sit there. Move now. Stop. Over long periods, the mind adapts. Some people withdraw inward. Others become hyper-aware of every sound and movement. The environment teaches constant vigilance or deep disengagement. Both are responses to the same condition, a world where space is never neutral. Correctional systems often justify these designs as necessary for safety, order, and efficiency. And in many cases, structure does reduce violence and unpredictability. But the question this documentary asks is not whether design works, but how it works and at what human cost. What happens when architecture becomes a form of authority? When walls replace words and corridors replace commands? When the building itself becomes part of the sentence? This is not a story about escape. It is a story about containment, about how modern prisons are built not just to hold bodies, but to shape behavior over time. How control can be quiet, constant, and deeply effective without ever raising its voice. As we move forward, we will examine how prison layouts influence movement, how restricted sightlines affect mental health, how controlled environments change decision-making, and how design choices made far from the cell can define life inside it. Because in the end, the most powerful force inside a prison may not be the guards, the rules, or the locks, but the space itself. When time becomes the environment asterisk. Time inside a high-security prison does not behave the way it does outside. On the surface, clocks still tick, lights still turn on and off, and schedules still exist. But for the people living inside facilities like ADX Florence, time slowly transforms from a neutral measurement into an active force, one that shapes mood, memory, and behavior. This chapter explores how waiting itself becomes the environment, and how the absence of clear timelines quietly rewires the human mind. In the free world, waiting is usually temporary and explained. A delayed train shows a new arrival time. A line moves forward. A calendar offers future markers, weekends, holidays, appointments. These signals give waiting an endpoint. Inside Supermax confinement, those markers are intentionally blurred or removed. Inmates wait without countdowns, without reassurance, and often without knowing what they're waiting for. That uncertainty is not accidental. It is structural. At ADX Florence, daily life is built around controlled pauses. Doors do not open when a person is ready. Meals do not arrive when hunger peaks. Responses do not come when questions are asked. Instead, everything arrives eventually. That word, eventually, becomes one of the most powerful psychological tools in the system. Eventually can mean minutes, hours, days, or longer. The lack of clarity forces the mind into a constant state of anticipation. This form of waiting differs from isolation alone. Isolation removes social input. Waiting removes resolution. The brain is wired to seek closure. When closure is denied repeatedly, stress accumulates. Cortisol levels rise. Attention narrows. Over time, the mind adapts by lowering expectations. Anticipation fades into resignation. This is not passivity. It is survival. One of the first effects of prolonged waiting is the distortion of time perception. Without meaningful variation in daily experience, minutes stretch and hours lose shape. When every day contains the same sequence, wake, wait, eat, wait, sit, wait, sleep, the brain struggles to form distinct memories. Research in psychology shows that novelty creates time awareness. Repetition compresses it. Days blur. Weeks disappear. Months feel strangely short in memory, yet painfully long in experience. Prisons like ADX Florence rely on this effect. By minimizing novelty and maximizing waiting, the system reduces impulsive behavior. When nothing happens quickly, there's little incentive to react quickly. Anger has nowhere to go. Frustration has no outlet. Over time, emotional intensity flattens. The individual becomes calmer on the surface, but often more fragile underneath. Waiting also alters how people relate to authority. When requests are met with silence or delayed responses, individuals learn that persistence does not speed outcomes. Repeatedly asking does not change timelines. This teaches a specific lesson. Initiative is ineffective. Instead of acting, the safest strategy becomes endurance. This shift is subtle but profound. It replaces agency with patience and choice with compliance. Importantly, this system does not require constant enforcement. Once waiting becomes normalized, people self-regulate. They stop expecting immediacy. They stop marking time. Some inmates intentionally avoid thinking about future events altogether. Others create rigid internal schedules, counting steps, repeating routines, marking imaginary hours, to reclaim a sense of control. These adaptations are coping mechanisms, not signs of comfort. Medical appointments offer a clear example. Inmates may know a request has been submitted, but not when it will be addressed. The uncertainty produces a constant low-level alertness. Will it be today? Tomorrow? Next week? The mind cycles through possibilities with no resolution. Over time, many stop asking altogether. The system achieves compliance without confrontation. This pattern extends to every aspect of daily life. Recreation time may occur, but not always at the same moment. Showers may be allowed, but only when scheduled. Communication opportunities exist, but within strict and often delayed frameworks. The key element is not denial, it is delay. Delay preserves the appearance of access while maintaining psychological pressure. Waiting also reshapes identity. Outside prison, people often define themselves by what they are moving toward: careers, goals, milestones. Inside long-term confinement, future orientation becomes risky. Hope tied to specific timelines can become a source of pain. As a result, many inmates learn to think in narrower windows. Today, this hour, this moment, life becomes fragmented into manageable units of endurance. This narrowing is not accidental. Systems built on waiting reduce long-term planning. They encourage focus on immediate compliance rather than distant outcomes. In this way, time becomes a quiet enforcer, guiding behavior without visible force. Correctional administrators often frame waiting as administrative necessity, logistics, security checks, procedural safeguards. And it is true that structure is required in high-risk environments. But the cumulative effect of endless waiting goes beyond logistics. It becomes psychological conditioning. It teaches patience not as a virtue, but as a requirement for stability. Over months and years, the mind adapts, emotional reactions slow, expectations lower. Some individuals report feeling detached from urgency altogether. Others experience heightened anxiety whenever something does happen, because change itself becomes unfamiliar. Both responses reflect the same truth. When time is controlled, behavior follows. This establishes a critical foundation for understanding life inside ADX Florence. Waiting is not empty time. It is active pressure. It shapes how people think, react, and survive. In the chapters ahead, we will examine how this manipulation of time interacts with space, routine, and uncertainty, creating a system where control is achieved not through force, but through patience imposed from the outside and absorbed on the inside. The absence of endpoints. One of the most powerful ways time is controlled inside high-security prisons is not by speeding it up or slowing it down, but by removing clear endpoints altogether. Outside prison, time is defined by conclusions. Workdays end. Appointments finish. Conversations conclude. Even difficult moments usually come with some form of closure. Inside facilities like ADX Florence, many processes begin without a clearly defined finish, and that absence becomes a psychological weight that follows inmates every day. An endpoint gives meaning to waiting. Without one, waiting turns into something else entirely. It becomes indefinite. It becomes heavy. It becomes mentally exhausting. Inside ADX Florence, inmates rarely know how long anything will take. They know routines exist, but those routines are not transparent. A door will open, but when? A response will come, but not on a predictable timeline. A decision will be made, but without a visible process. This lack of clarity creates a unique form of stress that does not spike sharply, but instead lingers quietly, accumulating over time. The human brain is built to manage uncertainty in short bursts. Long-term uncertainty, especially when combined with isolation, places continuous strain on cognitive and emotional systems. Psychologists refer to this as anticipatory stress, a condition where the mind remains alert not because something is happening, but because something might happen. When this state becomes permanent, it reshapes how a person thinks. In environments with clear endpoints, people can mentally prepare. They can pace themselves. They can tolerate discomfort because they know it will eventually end. Inside Supermax confinement, that reassurance is missing. An inmate may know their process exists, but not how long it will take or what factors influence it. This lack of information removes a sense of fairness and predictability, two elements that help humans cope with restriction. Even small examples reveal the pattern. An inmate may submit a request and receive no immediate feedback. The request has not been denied, but it has not been answered either. The mind fills that silence with speculation. Was it received? Was it ignored? Was it rejected? The uncertainty forces constant mental engagement. Over time, this becomes draining. The absence of endpoints also affects motivation. When outcomes are unclear, effort feels disconnected from results. In the outside world, effort is often rewarded in visible ways. Inside ADX Florence, effort does not always produce immediate or observable change. Compliance is expected regardless of outcome. This teaches a subtle lesson. Doing more does not necessarily lead to resolution. As a result, many inmates adjust their behavior. They stop measuring progress. They stop expecting feedback. Some withdraw emotionally. Others develop rigid internal routines to create artificial endpoints, counting days, marking patterns, repeating sequences of thought. These strategies are attempts to restore order in a system that withholds it. Another consequence of endpoint removal is a distortion of future thinking. When the future lacks structure, planning becomes risky. Thinking too far ahead can lead to frustration or despair if expectations are not met. To cope, many inmates limit their mental horizon. They focus on surviving the day, then the next. Long-term goals fade, replaced by short cycles of endurance. This narrowing of focus has psychological effects. It reduces anxiety related to unmet expectations, but also limits growth and emotional engagement. The mind becomes quieter, but also more constrained. Over time, this can lead to emotional flattening, a reduction in emotional highs and lows. While this may appear as calmness, it often reflects a deeper adaptation to uncertainty. The institution benefits from this adaptation. Inmates who no longer expect quick resolution are less likely to challenge delays. They become more compliant, not because they agree with the system, but because resistance feels futile. Control is achieved without confrontation. The environment does the work. Importantly, this system does not rely on deception. It relies on withholding specificity. Rules exist, procedures exist, but timelines are vague. Outcomes are conditional. This preserves authority while minimizing accountability. The system remains in control of when things begin and when they end. This dynamic also affects how inmates perceive time itself. Without endpoints, days feel endless in the moment but compressed in memory. Looking back, weeks seem to disappear. Looking forward, time feels immeasurable. This contradiction creates a sense of disorientation. The mind struggles to anchor itself in a timeline that lacks markers. Some inmates respond by detaching emotionally from time altogether. They stop tracking days. They stop counting weeks. This detachment can be protective, but it also deepens a sense of timelessness. Life becomes continuous present with no clear past or future. In this state, waiting is no longer something you do. It is something you are inside. Correctional systems often describe this structure as necessary for safety and order. And it is true that predictability can reduce conflict. But predictability, without endpoints, produces a different outcome. It creates stability at the cost of agency. It replaces participation with endurance. This reveals that control does not always require restriction of movement alone. It can be achieved by controlling resolution. When people cannot see the end of a process, they stop pushing toward it. They adapt instead. Over time, this adaptation becomes internalized. The system no longer needs to enforce waiting. The mind enforces it on itself. As we continue, we will explore how this absence of endpoints interacts with uncertainty, memory, and emotional regulation, revealing why time, when left undefined, becomes one of the most powerful tools of control inside ADX Florence. Living without a clock ***. Inside high-security prisons like ADX Florence, time does not disappear, but its meaning does. Clocks may exist somewhere in the facility. Schedules may be written in policy manuals. But for the individual inmate, time becomes abstract, indirect, and unreliable. This chapter examines what happens when people are forced to live without a clear sense of time, and how that condition slowly reshapes perception, memory, and behavior. In everyday life, clocks do more than tell us the hour. They organize identity. Morning signals purpose. Evening signals rest. Days of the week separate work from pause. These markers allow the mind to create rhythm. Rhythm creates stability. When that rhythm is removed or distorted, the mind must find new ways to orient itself or risk drifting into confusion. Inside ADX Florence, inmates do not experience time directly. They experience it through external signals. Lights turn on, doors open, meals arrive. These events replace clocks as indicators of progress. But unlike clocks, these signals are not precise or personal. They belong to the institution, not the individual. Time becomes something that happens to a person, not something they track themselves. This loss of time ownership has psychological consequences. When individuals cannot reliably measure time, they lose a key tool for emotional regulation. Anger, boredom, anticipation, and relief are all tied to duration. How long has this been happening? How much longer will it last? Without answers, emotions lose their boundaries. They either intensify or flatten. Many inmates describe an early phase of hypertension to time. They listen closely for footsteps. They count seconds between sounds. They try to predict routines. This is the mind attempting to regain control. But prediction without confirmation eventually fails. When patterns change without explanation, the effort becomes exhausting. Over time, a different adaptation occurs. Instead of tracking time, inmates begin to ignore it. They stop counting days. They stop asking what time it is. The mind shifts into a state of temporal detachment. This is not apathy, it is efficiency. Paying attention to something you cannot influence becomes emotionally costly. Psychologically, this detachment reduces stress in the short term, but it also alters memory formation. Memory relies on sequence. Before, after, during. When time loses structure, memories become harder to organize. Days feel identical. Events blur. This is why long periods of confinement often feel strangely short in hindsight, even though they feel long while being lived. Neuroscience supports this experience. The brain encodes time based on change. When environments lack variation, fewer memory markers are created. As a result, the brain compresses those periods in recall. Months of repetition may occupy only a small space in memory. This compression can feel disorienting, even unsettling, when individuals later try to reflect on their experiences. Living without time markers also affects motivation. Outside prison, goals are often tied to deadlines. Finish this by Friday. Wait 2 weeks. In prison, goals lose their timelines. Without deadlines, effort becomes detached from outcome. This can lead to emotional numbness or, in some cases, bursts of anxiety when unexpected changes occur. Sleep patterns are another area deeply affected. Natural light cues are limited. Artificial lighting often remains consistent. Without sunrise and sunset as anchors, circadian rhythms weaken. Sleep becomes fragmented. Some inmates sleep too much to pass time. Others struggle to sleep at all. Both patterns further distort the perception of time passing. Importantly, this condition does not require extreme deprivation to be effective. The absence of a personal clock, combined with delayed and unpredictable signals, is enough. The mind fills the gaps with speculation, then eventually stops trying. Control is achieved not by confusion alone, but by fatigue of attention. Some inmates attempt to rebuild time internally. They create mental calendars. They assign meaning to small events. They use exercise, reading, or repetitive tasks as anchors. These strategies are acts of resistance, not against rules, but against disorientation. They help preserve a sense of self in an environment designed to erase temporal individuality. From the institution's perspective, this system reduces impulsivity. When time feels slow and undefined, sudden reactions decrease. People become cautious. They wait. They pause. They hesitate. This supports order and predictability. But it also reveals a deeper truth. Controlling time is not about speed. It is about ownership. When the institution owns time, it owns behavior. It decides when something happens, how long it lasts, and when it ends. The individual adapts by surrendering time awareness. This surrender is quiet, gradual, and rarely visible, but it is one of the most powerful shifts that occurs inside long-term confinement. This shows that time does not need to be taken away to be weaponized. It only needs to be removed from the individual's control. Later we will examine how this loss of time interacts with uncertainty, creating a mental state where anticipation itself becomes exhausting and compliance becomes the easiest path forward. Control without touch. How isolation reshapes behavior. By the time an inmate reaches the stage explored in this chapter, isolation is no longer something they experience. It is something they internalize. In Title VII Story, Chapter 4 marks the point where control no longer needs physical force, raised voices, or visible punishment. The system has already done its work. What remains is quiet compliance shaped by environment, repetition, and psychological pressure. Inside high-security prisons and Supermax facilities, isolation is not just a housing decision. It is a behavioral tool. Inmates may spend 22 to 24 hours a day alone in a cell barely larger than a parking space. The walls do not move, the routine never changes, and human interaction is reduced to brief commands shouted through metal doors. Over time, the brain adapts, not by resisting, but by conserving energy. This is where behavior begins to change in subtle but powerful ways. Prisoners learn that movement brings consequences. Asking questions can delay meals. Speaking out of turn can mean fewer privileges. Even standing at the wrong moment during count can result in disciplinary action. Slowly, inmates stop testing boundaries. Silence becomes safer than speech. Stillness becomes protection. Psychologists who have studied long-term isolation often describe a process called behavioral narrowing. Choices shrink. Emotional range flattens. The mind begins to focus only on immediate survival. When food comes, when lights go off, when the door opens. Long-term thinking fades because there is nothing ahead to plan for. In this environment, control becomes invisible. There are no beatings required to enforce obedience. The architecture does the work. The schedule does the work. The uncertainty does the work. Inmates never know when a routine might change or when a small action might bring punishment. This unpredictability trains the brain to remain passive, constantly alert but rarely active. One former inmate described it this way: you stop thinking about freedom. You start thinking about avoiding trouble. That becomes your whole world. Even physical posture changes. Guards often note that inmates in prolonged isolation move slower, speak less, and avoid eye contact. Some begin pacing the same few steps repeatedly, not out of restlessness but habit. Others remain motionless for hours, lying on bunks, staring at walls, conserving mental energy. Human connection, one of the strongest drivers of behavior, is intentionally minimized. Meals are slid through slots. Medical checks are conducted through doors. Recreation, if allowed, happens alone in small outdoor cages. Without feedback from other people, social instincts weaken. Empathy dulls. Communication skills erode. This has consequences beyond prison walls. When inmates eventually return to general population or are released entirely, they often struggle to adjust. Normal conversation feels overwhelming. Crowds trigger anxiety. Decision-making becomes difficult because isolation removed the need to choose. In prison, every choice was made for them. Outside, freedom feels chaotic rather than liberating. From the institution's perspective, isolation works. It reduces violence. It simplifies management. It creates predictability. But the cost is paid internally by the mind and behavior of the person inside the cell. This forces us to confront a difficult truth. Control does not always look like force. Sometimes it looks like silence, routine, and walls that never change. By the time isolation has done its work, resistance is no longer necessary to suppress. The environment itself has become the enforcer, and I will talk about the reason the effects of that control do not end when the cell door finally opens. The weight of anticipation, how uncertainty shapes the mind. Inside Supermax prisons like ADX Florence, the mind is under constant pressure, not from immediate threats, but from the unknown. By Chapter 5 of Title 7, it becomes clear that the most powerful tool the system wields is not walls, bars, or even isolation itself, but uncertainty. This uncertainty extends to every aspect of daily life: meals, movements, privileges, medical attention, and even communication. Its omnipresence gradually shapes behavior, emotional responses, and cognitive patterns. Humans are wired to predict. The brain constantly calculates what comes next, weighing risks and rewards. When those predictions are consistently thwarted, stress accumulates. In high-security confinement, this is exactly what happens. An inmate may know that breakfast will arrive, but not exactly when. A guard might open the door, but not for them specifically. Requests for privileges may take days or weeks, with no feedback. Each unanswered question triggers a cycle of anticipation. The brain remains alert, ready to react, but the reaction is often futile. Over time, this chronic state of alertness becomes exhausting. Psychologists call this anticipatory stress. Unlike immediate stress, which spikes in response to events, anticipatory stress is sustained, persistent, and invisible. It wears down mental resilience slowly. Even when nothing negative occurs, the mind is preemptively strained, preparing for events that may never happen. The effects are profound. Anxiety becomes a baseline state, not a reaction. Decisions that might once have seemed simple now feel dangerous. Risk assessment is skewed. Inmates may avoid activities that could potentially draw attention, even if those activities would have offered comfort, stimulation, or social interaction. Silence, inaction, and passivity become strategies for survival, but uncertainty also reshapes time perception. Without consistent markers, the mind struggles to organize past events and predict the future. Days blend together. Weeks collapse in memory. A single day can feel like a year, while months pass unnoticed. The result is disorientation, a disconnection from linear time that reinforces dependence on the system for structure. Interestingly, some inmates attempt to regain a sense of control through self-imposed routines. Counting steps, repeating phrases, organizing objects, or mentally tracking days become small acts of agency. These internal schedules offer comfort, a way to navigate the uncertainty. But they also highlight the psychological manipulation of the environment. The mind must create order where the institution deliberately withholds it. The uncertainty also affects relationships. Even in rare moments of interaction, inmates cannot rely on predictability. Conversations are brief, monitoring is constant, and outcomes are unclear. Trust erodes because consistency is absent. Social bonds, already minimal in isolation, remain fragile. Loneliness intensifies, compounded by the tension of not knowing what will happen next. Physical effects follow cognitive strain. Sleep patterns are disrupted. Appetite fluctuates. Tension manifests in posture and movement. In the absence of control over external circumstances, the mind and body adapt by focusing narrowly on survival. Mental flexibility diminishes, and emotional responses are dampened. Institutional officials understand these dynamics. By fostering an environment where uncertainty is routine, compliance is encouraged without overt confrontation. Inmates adapt not because they agree with the rules, but because the cost of defiance, emotional, cognitive, or physical, is too high. By the end of this stage, inmates often reach a state of quiet compliance. It is a survival mechanism, but also a profound psychological shift. Where resistance might once have existed, only vigilance remains. The mind becomes attuned to small cues, hyper-focused on minor events, and largely detached from long-term planning or emotion. This illustrates the subtlety of control. It is less about physical domination and more about shaping perception. The walls and cells remain silent, but their influence is pervasive. Every unanswered question, delayed response, or unpredictable routine trains the mind to conform. Over months and years, the system molds behavior through anticipation itself. As we will explore how coping mechanisms emerge in this environment, from both psychological adaptation and creative strategies that inmates use to reclaim a sense of agency, however limited it may be. Life inside the shadows of ADX Florence. As we reach the conclusion of Title VII, it is impossible not to reflect on the immense psychological machinery operating within the walls of ADX Florence. This is not a story of physical violence alone. It is a story of quiet, relentless control, a system designed not only to confine the body but to shape the mind. From the first day in facility, inmates are introduced to routines, silence, and uncertainty, each carefully calibrated to erode their sense of time, self, and autonomy. Isolation, as we have seen, is more than a physical barrier. It is an instrument of behavioral shaping, guiding inmates towards stillness, passivity, and compliance without direct coercion. The absence of social interaction, the unpredictability of schedules, and the lack of personal temporal markers slowly rewire perception. Emotional responses are muted, reactions measured, and mental energy conserved, creating a form of control that is subtle yet profoundly effective. Inmates who enter with resistance gradually learn that the environment itself enforces rules. The walls do not speak, yet they communicate volumes. The doors may not strike, yet they dictate movement. The routine, so monotonous and unchanging, Condition the mind to anticipate, wait, and adapt to schedules that are not their own. Freedom becomes irrelevant inside the cell because the system has already defined the parameters of survival. The psychological effects extend beyond the prison walls. Former inmates often recount difficulty reintegrating into normal society. The human mind, once conditioned to predict, wait, and comply, finds it difficult to adapt to a world of freedom, choice, and uncertainty. Social interactions, decision-making, and even perception of time may remain disrupted long after release. The control that begins inside the cell leaves an enduring imprint on cognition, behavior, and emotional processing. Yet, despite the weight of such confinement, the human spirit persists in quiet ways. Some inmates develop coping mechanisms, small rituals that provide structure, counting steps, mentally marking days, or finding small creative outlets become tiny acts of agency. These strategies do not overturn the system, but they remind us that even under extreme psychological pressure, the mind seeks ways to assert identity and maintain selfhood. This exploration of life inside ADX Florence reveals the nuanced and deliberate ways control operates in extreme environments. It is not simply a story of punishment. It is a lesson in how institutions can shape human behavior using silence, time, and uncertainty as tools. For viewers, this provides insight not only into the lives of those confined, but also into the deeper mechanics of human psychology, resilience, and adaptation under extraordinary conditions. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.